Hi, I'm Michael Senoff, founder and CEO of HardToFindSeminars.com. For the last 5 years, I've interviewed the world's best business and marketing minds. Along the way, I've created a successful publishing business all from home from my two-car garage. When my first child was born, he was very sick, and it was then that I knew I had to have a business that I could operate from home. Now my challenge is to build the world's largest free resource for online downloadable MP3 audio business interviews. I knew I needed a site that contained strategies, solutions, and inside angles to help you live better, to save and make more money, to stay healthier, and to get more out of life. I've learned a lot in the last 5 years, and today I'm going to show you the skills you need to survive. Hi, it's Michael Senoff with Michael Senoff's HardToFindSeminars.com. The title of this interview is called The Average Guy's Guide to the Licensing Game. How to use it to start a business, expand a business, or just make money quickly. Licensing is a creative game with very little boundaries or limitations. Known as the poor man's advertising, it can give enormous media exposure to even the smallest of businesses by leveraging off the popularity of movies, events, or brands. Licensing crosses over into all markets, can easily launch a product, expand a business, make a career, or create a household name overnight. And in this two-part seminar, you'll hear all about it from licensing expert Brenner. Rand's been in the licensing game since the early days when even huge corporations were still guessing at how to make money off of it. He's helped Warner Brothers Studios successfully license the first Batman movie and also helped Saban Entertainment make it huge with the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers brand. And in this interview, Rand shares his biggest and easiest secret techniques he's learned along the way, making it big in licensing intellectual property. Rand demystifies the truth about how to use licensing as a shortcut to success, even if you're on a shoestring budget. According to Rand, timing is everything when it comes to licensing. So in part one, you'll hear ways to look down the horizon and identify licensing opportunities before the competition. You'll also hear an overview of licensing with specific examples of how even the smallest of companies can use licensing every day to expand their business and break into new territories. Here's some of the key points of what you're going to learn. Examples of intellectual property licensing. 5 quick start steps for using it to make money. A can't-miss way to get started. How to present yourself when putting licensing agreements together. How to start with no prior experience. Everything you need to find intellectual properties to license. Licensing versus selling. The truth about both. Exploding the education myth with IP licensing. Steps to go from zero to making money in licensing in 90 days. Real-life insights into identifying lucrative licensing opportunities. What your first move should be once you find a product to license. The surprising reason why you don't have to be a lawyer. Tell me a story how maybe a guy in his garage took advantage of this Batman license and what was going on with it when you were on the scene there.
You know, my background is coming out of the entertainment industry. I spent a number of years at Warner Brothers Consumer Products, and then I was there at the time they launched the first Batman movie, which was a very interesting story. Many people are probably very familiar with Batman through the generations of the comic book.
They had TV shows at that time, right?
Well, Batman was one of the first to come on from the comic books, if you will, and then you saw a lot of other types of shows that came on. There was, I don't know if you remember this, the Green Hornet TV show for a little while. Then you saw the Incredible Hulk in the 70s. And these were all offshoots from these comic books that had been around, in many cases, 5 and 6 decades, because many of these characters that we're talking about actually got started in the 1930s, some of them even as long ago as the 20s. But they built their primary awareness and audience was through these comic books. And they became very, very well known, especially to, if you want to call it, the older generations, in which comic books at one time, as it evolved in the 30s and 40s and 50s, were very, very big forms of entertainment, if you will. And there was a lot of stores, and people used to hang out in comic book stores. So Batman became well recognized as a character, but at that time, DC was still operating as an independent company. By the time the movie was produced, it had been acquired by Warner Brothers. It was becoming part of a very large conglomerate. And so the idea for the movie actually had been around at the studios for almost 5 years prior to it ever reaching the big screen. I think, and interestingly enough, the previous comic book character who had been the most well-known on TV was Superman. They produced 5 of them, and it was interesting because they had developed those. Fascinating history, but there was a company known at that time as Licensing Corporation of America. Licensing Corporation of America had a long history. They represented Warner Brothers for Looney Tunes. They also represented Major League Baseball, and I think at one time they also represented hockey. Many people don't realize Major League Baseball itself did not have its own licensing division. Licensing of entertainment content, sports leagues, and all this really was a business that really didn't get started until the late 80s. And many people don't realize that because up until that point, a lot of these entertainment properties, if you will, whether it's a movie or a sporting event, made their movie in what was then the business model, that of selling tickets and popcorn and peanuts. This licensing thing was really, go talk to somebody in the back room at the marketing department if you want to make a toy or a T-shirt, because nobody thought that there was really any money in it. It wasn't even a blip on the radar screen, and you'd be hard-pressed to have met anybody who was doing licensing. It was usually an assistant in the marketing department somewhere, or it was always relegated to the back room because, again, there was no recognition by many of these sports leagues or entertainment companies that there was any value in licensing merchandise and selling it at retail. It wasn't on the radar screen at that time.
How about Disney, Walt Disney? Didn't they have a handle on it?
They were the most active in licensing, but their division was small at that time. Even Disney merchandise, for the most part, you didn't see it as extensively in the market back then as you do now. Most of their licensing evolved around their theme parks. And so they really weren't doing anything. And many of the other studios, for the most part, I can tell you through my friends and associates, were acting as agents and independent consultants if, in fact, there was any licensing going on. It was just one of these things that was handed off to somebody in the marketing department or someplace that said, look, we get these phone calls every now and then from companies that say, hey, can I use the rights to this movie or TV show to put on my T-shirts or toys? So at any rate, with the first Batman movie, the studio had decided to make a concentrated effort around licensing, and so they moved the division out, and they had to go find people to staff it. And so they brought in people from advertising and marketing and various places, and it was one of those things where literally we joined the licensing division, we were handed a telephone, and they said, go license this to somebody.
So you guys were selling licenses. You were hustling.
We were hustling for licenses, and this is what makes the story interesting. As we were out there trying to license Batman, every major manufacturer that we talked to said, we're not interested. This Batman is just this comic book character. Superman had just been done. We don't see any value in it. We don't want the license.
What's your sales pitch? If you're calling these guys, what are you telling them? What's the big promise when you're making cold calls?
Well, that's always a fascinating question because sometimes you're working with limited information. I will say this. I guess it's one of the inside stories of the studio. The licensing division was really the stepchild of the studio. And by that I mean there was no division anywhere that wanted anything to do with us. We were considered the pariahs, that we would take this artwork that was being developed by production and we would grossly commercialize it. So we literally were working out there with no support from anybody. And so what we had to do is we had to scrape together any information that we could, and we would basically find leads, make cold calls, go to trade shows, and start talking to companies about the fact that there's this movie coming out called Batman. And basically, would you be interested in licensing it for shorts or T-shirts or whatever it is? And that's literally the way it ran.
But you couldn't promise it was going to be a huge hit. You know, that's the thing. You're selling a potential hit.
That's it. And nobody even really knew. That's where it got really interesting because you had major toy companies and other manufacturers who were very large in the market, and they took a look at it, and their assessment of it is we're not going to risk our investment on these entertainment projects, especially from comic books, because we just don't see any market for it. At that time, they had very well-established brands of their own, be it boys' toys or girls' toys or whatever it is. And at that time, too, there were many more toy companies that were out there, many more retailers. So they did not view it, as did many retailers, as any kind of really viable brand at that point.
All right, let me ask you this. Let's say you've got a listener, and he's approaching an entertainment property or some license that could be a long shot. So you're saying no one was interested. How good of a deal, if you had called me on the phone and said, Mike, do you want a T-shirt license on the Batman character, what kind of deal could I have gotten at that time?
There were people that picked up Batman for about $2,500 and about an 8% royalty.
You mentioned categories. Explain to the listener, are there hundreds of different categories? Is it standardized now?
Well, now it's a lot more. So when I refer to categories, I'm really talking about product categories, toys, apparel, food, beverage, electronics, household goods, sporting goods, musical instruments. Those are what are generally referred to as product categories.
So for $2,500, I could have gotten a license. Give me an example for clothing.
Well, for example, you may have gotten a license and said, geez, I can make some T-shirts and hats and headbands.
And I would have the absolute exclusive license on hats, T-shirts, and headbands.
Well, now, generally, licenses are not written as exclusives, and there's a lot of reasons that they're not. But you would have received the license. It would have been a non-exclusive license. I'll caveat that by saying that most of the time in entertainment, even in sporting goods, it's non-exclusive, but in the negotiations it's discussed that there won't be other direct competitors licensed. It's not in anybody's interest to have two of the same thing on the market.
I see. So generally today, companies don't license exclusives unless it's just, a huge deal.
Exactly.
Tell me about this little bike story, a story about an unknown family and a company that had been producing bicycles.
Well, that's one of many stories, but it's interesting. Again, it's one of these stories where you've got some entrepreneurs, they've got a little bike company, it's been operating as a family.
What do you mean bike company? They manufacture bicycles?
Tricycles, kids' bicycles. At that time, they made a lot of the low-cost bikes. Distribution was starting to open up. At that time, Walmart was still building, so they did a lot of work with Kmart and Target and places like that.
Was this a deal you got on your own?
It's a combination of factors. Warner Brothers, we went out to the licensing show, which at that time was in New York at the Javits Center. It was very small at the time, and we were sending out PR releases just to get the word out, okay, so people knew we had this property. And so as a result of going to trade shows, this company happened to get some information, and so they called up the studio, and they were referred over to me since that was the category I was handling. And basically they were interested in getting a license for something. We hadn't talked about anything. And we said, great. And they set up an appointment, said they'd like to come in and discuss. And prior to that, of course, they sent out a few samples of what they made, water bottles, and they sent a catalog with the bikes. And we said, okay, fine, come on in. And basically it was one of the brothers who owned the company, and they came in and we started talking, and we talked about the fact that we had this Batman movie. And they took a look at it, and they thought, okay, why not? Batman bike. Sure, we could do that. And so I think our deal was $2,500 or $3,000. And they decided, okay, we'll make some of these bikes for kids at about 10 or 12-year-olds, 2-speed bikes, and we'll soup them up. We'll put some stickers on them and make them in black, and we'll make them look really cool. For more exclusive interviews on business, marketing, advertising, and copywriting, go to Michael Senoff's hardtofindseminars.com.
Okay, let me ask you this. Now, you selling the license, you guys were pretty desperate. He made these bikes. Really, there wasn't too much qualifying you had to do. You knew he manufactured bikes. You were desperate to sell licenses. So how much qualifying did you have to do to be able to take his money and agree to the license?
It's interesting that you raise qualifications. Everything changes. Success breeds maturity in anything. So initially, I'd say the folks that came in, were able to pretty much qualify to get a license with minimal qualifications. The fact that they were a viable company, they had product, they could demonstrate that they had some distribution somewhere, pretty much qualified them to get a license.
Okay, but as the licensor, you knew you were taking a chance with all these licensees. There's no guarantee that they're going to be able to sell tons and tons of bikes. But if they do great, it's all a risk, right, on both sides?
It is a risk on both sides. And you bring up a really interesting point when it comes to this, because really in the licensing business, timing is everything. And it's one of these stories that I share with people that because of the situation, because Batman wasn't being perceived as a viable property, because the studio was somewhat desperate to get licenses, these companies were able to come in and basically take, for them, it was a risk in the fact that they're going to put money down and make this product. For the studio, they were just looking to populate the licensee list, which is the terminology. The studio at the time, populate the licensee list so that they could go and provide something to the producers to let them know that we had something going on. So it was an opportunity, and the opportunity was for these small companies who basically came in and said, okay, we'll take a shot on it. And by virtue of a series of factors that were going on in timing, you didn't have to have a lot to be able to qualify for these licenses. And I will say this, in many cases, there were some people that just happened to know people in the studio. They were friends of friends, so they called up and said, I got a buddy that makes water bottles, and they said, okay, great, you want a license? Here you go. They wound up getting a license because nobody really knew what was going to happen with this thing. thing. There was a lot of drivers within the studio that had more to do with the politics of the studio and the fact that they wanted to keep the producers happy and they just wanted to show some products. I mean, it's a very dynamic market, and I'm sure your listeners have probably heard stories about entertainment, and entertainment can be pretty crazy. That was the set of dynamics that were going on at the time. Beyond that, it gets even crazier because now we'd write up these licensing deals.
Before we go into, tell me what happened with the licensor of the bikes. Did he end up selling a bunch of bikes?
Oh, he did phenomenally well. They wound up getting their bikes into Walmart, and they probably did $10 million plus.
And this would have been after the movie aired and was a hit, right?
Yeah, the movie came out. Well, it's an interesting set of dynamics. Nobody believed it, and then suddenly there was a tipping point, if you will, that the public suddenly sparked to the movie. And what happened is literally there was a 60 or 90-day period when all of a sudden, out of the blue, the media just turned on it. The public was very engaged with it. The retailers started responding. The phones started ringing to the manufacturers. Suddenly, everybody wanted product and to get involved. Nobody quite sure what it was, but suddenly all these little companies who had been going out to the retailers saying, hey, we got this Batman license. What do you think? And the retailer buyers would go, maybe, maybe not. We're not sure. Whatever it is, suddenly something happened in the marketplace, and now they all wanted the product. And for many of these companies, suddenly they got swept up in a whirlwind. And before they knew it, they were getting phone calls from the licensing division saying, you got to get a hold of Target, you got to get a hold of Kmart, Walmart. What products do you have? We're trying to set this up. Licensee lists were going out there, and they were getting calls from buyers because suddenly, for whatever reason, it took off. And that's one of the amazing upside opportunities that happens with entertainment is something triggers it, and before you know it, your business can be swept up into a multi-million or multi-billion-dollar entertainment brand.
And the studio becomes your partner.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is once the movie hit, the studio is getting all these calls from major manufacturers, retailers, and you're sending out the official licensee list. Is that right?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up because licensing is more than just about signing the deal and getting the rights to make a product. What you're forming is a partnership. And many people, especially listeners out there, if you're an entrepreneur or a business owner, have to understand you're opening up a relationship. And what the licensing agreement is doing is giving you an opportunity to open up a relationship and leverage that relationship beyond just the fact that you're a licensee. What happens is the studios then put together licensee lists. And these licensee lists are sent out to all the major retailers and buyers. And today, since the industry has grown very large, today all the studios maintain what's called retail development divisions. And all these divisions do is meet with every major retail buyer out there on a weekly and sometimes daily basis to update them on all the licensed products, the new licensees, and to develop in-store promotions and special incentive programs built around the upcoming movies or TV shows to help sell merchandise. And what happens is you are now part of that program. In fact, there's a whole strategy that many small business entrepreneurs can use. It's affectionately referred to in the industry as poor man's advertising. And that is where if you've got a new consumer product you want to introduce into the market, and I'll use toys as an example, it's very expensive to introduce a toy product today because if you go to retail and you want to create your own brand, you're going to meet with these buyers and they're going to say, well, nobody knows about who you are and what your product is, so how much are you going to spend in advertising? You know, you got to commit to TV, you got to commit to print. It can be very expensive. You're probably looking at $10, $20 million to try to launch your own brand into retail today, especially at toys, because retailers today are not in the business of letting you put stuff on the shelf and hope it sells. Okay, they're on the business of selling merchandise, and if your product is not known, they haven't got room for it. So the opportunity is through licensing, and this is a strategy that's employed by many of the companies that I work with, is they basically license these well-known kids' TV shows and movies because they're established brands in the market. And what happens is once you license them, you now leverage up on the relationship that the studios have already established by virtue of the fact the TV show or movie has created awareness among the consumers, but more importantly, it's been out there now for a period of years. It's established itself at retail, and now the buyers are interested in finding out about any new product that's coming out because that's part of this brand. It could be Batman, it could be Barney, it could be Sesame Street, it could be Wiggles, you name it. What happens now is you have the ability, if you will, as a startup, but I say that with a caveat because you have to be a little savvy about how you would, as a startup, get the license, but there are ways you can do it. But what this essentially does is allow you to take your product and immediately go to the top-tier retailers as part of, quote-unquote, a major kids brand. And now all of a sudden, instead of having to spend $20 million on advertising, you suddenly are moving right in. And now the requirements for your product to be in there are much, much less. In fact, they can be very little, since it's now being supported by a TV show. There's other things that may come along. There may be an advertising fund that the licensor may require you to put in a few $1,000s, or there may be promotional events that the retailer's putting together where all the licensees will be required to make a commitment of whatever it is, $5,000 or $10,000. But the strategy is one in which your cost to get into those major retailers is significantly less because you're part of a major brand.
Yeah, it's just the ultimate joint venture, marrying a toy manufacturer with a huge brand with appeal. It's just instant distribution. It's fascinating.
It is, and it's a strategy that for many, as I said, entrepreneurs, small businesses should really take a hard look at. And, of course, we're talking about major entertainment properties, but this goes across the board. There's many, many opportunities on smaller properties in which entrepreneurs and small businesses can get a foothold. I mean, obviously now with the way the movies are today, it's very challenging as a small up-and-coming business to get those movie licenses, but there's a lot of second- and third-tier entertainment content that is now coming out. The distribution channels are changing online, so there's many, many opportunities to be able to access this content and be able to use it as a launching platform to get your product situated at retail and online.
Hey, I was just thinking, I just interviewed a motorcycle daredevil stunt guy named Bob Gill. He was called the Florida Flyer. And this was back in the 70s. Evel Knievel, was already around for about 4 years, but this guy kind of started jumping and beating all of Evel Knievel's records. And he was telling me the Evel Knievel, the toy license, they did about $350 million back in the 70s. Do you know anything about the history on that?
Yeah, Evel Knievel actually was a fairly well-known brand back then, and they probably did those numbers. I mean, a lot of the success of a lot of these licenses, too, depends on how crowded the marketplace is. And again, in the 70s and 80s, it was fairly uncrowded, so there's many of these one-offs or these odd kind of personality or character licenses that actually did some pretty large numbers in the market simply because there wasn't a lot of competition. So for Evel Knievel, who back in the 70s was, fairly well-known character who rides a motorcycle, you had a number of manufacturers where that was a real good fit to make motorcycles or figures with Evel Knievel on there. So in all likelihood, there probably was a fairly successful merchandise program. And again, it all depends on your viewpoint on it. But, again, if you were a small manufacturer, got involved with Evel Knievel, if you could go sell $5 or $10 million worth of product.
Not too bad. I don't think they could have sold those little motorcycles without Evel Knievel's name. Do you know anything about the Bakugan character, Spin Master, the Bakugan toys?
Spin Master's an interesting story. They're a Canadian company, and their business is predominantly built on licensed properties, not only entertainment properties, but also inventions. And it's a strategy they use to grow very quickly to become a very, very large company.
Bakugan was Toy of the Year, I think, last year. And I've got a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, and believe me, we've got plenty of those.
Oh, yeah. Spin Master is a very, very big player in the licensing business. They license a lot of properties. And that strategy in itself can become tricky. I mean, there's a whole discussion to have on how you use that. But they've been very successful in leveraging up on the properties that they've acquired, both entertainment as well as inventors, technologies, people that have invented products. And they very quickly turn those brands into multi-million-dollar sellers, as well as help to establish Spin Master as one of the largest toy companies in a very relatively short period of time. I mean, they got started probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little more. But in the context of looking at growing a company to a couple of $100 million, they ramped up very quickly using the licensing model.
All right, give the listener a quick, easy, brain-dead definition of what licensing is. So after hearing some of these stories, they kind of get it. What is licensing in a nutshell?
Essentially what you're doing, if you are looking to license an entertainment, a TV show or a movie, you're essentially renting the rights. You're going to them and say, I want to rent the rights to use that character or that logo on my T-shirts. It's much like real estate. They are the landlord. They own the intellectual property. You'll notice the connection, and here's an easy way to remember it. You have real estate, which is known as property. You have IP, intellectual property. Copyrights, trademarks. It is property. It operates as an asset, much like real estate does. Of course, the significant difference is one is tangible and one is intangible. And for your listeners, it means one is you can touch and feel it, and the other is it comes from the mind. So you can't touch and feel it. Okay? okay?
All right, so let's go into your Power Rangers story. I know what Power Rangers are. I've seen the TV show, and I know about my kids and my cousins having the toys. Tell me the story of Power Rangers.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Power Rangers was a similar type of situation. You know, after I left Warner Brothers, I moved over to Saban Entertainment, and the story of Power Rangers was very similar. It was a small studio, and the owner of the company had gone to Japan back in the 80s and acquired the rights to this Japanese animation from one of these animation companies in Japan that had produced this stuff. And
Well, let me ask you this before you go into the story. When you went over to Saban, did you go over there specifically for licensing expertise?
Right. In other words, Saban was a small entertainment company. It's another interesting story. The founder of the company, Chaim Saban, had come over and was a music producer. Started off producing the music soundtracks for kids' shows, and then, of course, they got their one break with Marvel to produce the animation for one of their early animated series. And at that time, Saban was known as the knockoff artist. At that time, Disney had put out Little Mermaid, and Saban had put out Saban's Little Mermaid. Disney had its Aladdin, and Saban put out his Aladdin. And basically what he was doing is riding the coattails of what Disney was doing with their entertainment.
What was he doing with his stuff, movies or TV?
It was TV shows, just the low end. It was the quick knockoffs, produce it down and dirty, and ride the coattails of the awareness that the audience had for these cartoons. So there's many, many strategies you can use in entertainment content.
All right, so he went to Japan, and did he get the full exclusive rights to that Power Rangers?
Yeah, what happened, it was part of a library from Toei Animation, and he had gone out in the 80s just looking for content from other parts of the world and had the idea that, you know, we could take this content, repackage it for the U.S. at a very, very low cost.
Was it successful in Japan, Power Rangers?
Yeah, Power Rangers had actually been known not as Power Rangers, but as its Japanese name. It had actually been out for 20 years. It was still being aired. It's just that the company that was producing it wasn't doing anything. It was a Japanese live-action kids show, and so they didn't view it as having any viability for the U.S. market.
Anyone listening to this, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm looking for a good investment in IP, intellectual property. That's all he was doing. He was looking internationally for some good IP products.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, it's interesting. That's a good point that you bring up, is many people, you know, have to realize that people are out there investing in IP. They're not creating, you know, a lot of this entertainment content, and Saban was a perfect example. He produced very, very few original content productions. 85 to 90% of everything they produced was licensed IP that they acquired from somebody else that had already been produced in some other format or some other language.
And he changed the name and remarketed it for America.
Changed the name, re-edited it, pulled out the Asian-looking characters and added in, you know, your black, white, two girls, and a Hispanic, right? Edited that together for about $20,000. And then proceeded to go out and try to pitch it to one of the television networks to see if they'd buy it and start airing it.
And that's what he did.
Yeah, except people have to understand, it took him 8 years before that show ever got on the air.
So had he been pitching it the whole time?
Pitching it all the time. And if you saw the first episodes of Power Rangers, you'd look at the thing and recoil in horror.
Oh, yeah, it was terrible.
You said, you're telling me that a show named Power Rangers with a bunch of high school kids that click their hands together and turn into these costume characters with these megazords that go out and fight the evil Lord Zed?
That's right. Who went for it?
Well, it was another interesting story. Along with Power Rangers, because it had been very successful in Japan, there was a toy company that had a U.S. division that was essentially bankrupt. And nobody would give them, Bandai wasn't doing anything in the U.S. And I know, I used to call on them when I was at Warner Brothers, and it used to be the creative director and the president up in a little room in the toy building, and the only license they could ever get was Tom and Jerry. So they didn't really have a viable business. And what happened is when Power Rangers was acquired by Saban, part of the licensing deal was that Bandai had the first rights for it here in the U.S., and so they came along with the deal. But as far as the other categories I'm talking about, that was wide open. And so once again, the licensing division, we had to go out and find companies that wanted to license this Power Rangers. Now, keep in mind, we started out very early. The show hadn't even gotten on the air yet, and by the time we got it placed on the air, most people had looked at this show and said, I don't know that this is going to make it. And so once again, there was an opportunity because most of the companies that we licensed were these small entrepreneurs who were willing to take a risk, who were ponying up $2,500 and 8% and said, okay, we'll take a shot on this Power Rangers thing. And what happened is they put it on the air, I think it was the fall of '92, and within 4 months, suddenly the kids were glued, the ratings were off the charts, and before they knew it, the retail demand was through the roof.
You're listening to an exclusive interview found on Michael Senoff's HardToFindSeminars.com. Okay, and so the retail demand was coming back to Saban saying, are there any products with these characters?
Absolutely there were. And so what was happening is we had licensee lists. They wanted those lists of companies that were licensed, and they were contacting them to say, we need your product.
When you were selling the Power Ranger licenses, you knew that there was going to be a show being aired, right? That's the carrot.
Well, initially when you go out, I mean, it's a combination of things. Of course, they have a new show coming out, so they want to bring licensees. It all works hand in hand. Now what happens is, licensing helps promote the show. The show helps promote licensing. The more products you have in the market, the broader the exposure you get. So it's a partnership, and it's one that now it's a model that's very matured, and it's used extensively as a component to help promote the movie and expand the awareness and support it and generate revenues and things like that. So generally you'll find that, as new shows or movies come out, there's always going to be a licensing opportunity, more so with kids stuff and animation than there is with live action. And for any small business or entrepreneur who's thinking about this or would like to get involved in it, the trick here is to look down the horizon to find out what's happening a year or two down the road, which you can do. Because the earlier that you can identify these properties, the better the opportunity to get the license. It's like anything else, supply and demand. If you're one of the early ones to get involved with an entertainment property, you're going to get the best deal.
That's good, but are there inside ways for a guy like myself or someone who wants to take advantage of a license to get kind of insider information of upcoming TV shows that most of the public doesn't know about?
Sure. You do a little homework. The Internet's a fabulous tool now. You can get information on just about everything coming up. It's like anything else. You just have to go out and research the information, but you've got Hollywood Reporter and Variety. You've got licensing organizations and licensing trade magazines that are constantly updating and presenting news stories about various properties. So there's many, many sources that can be tapped into. And it's not only entertainment content, by the way. It's across the board. It could be entertainment, artwork, sports. Any number of different categories are out there. I know we've been talking about entertainment, but, there's many other content opportunities that exist beyond entertainment, inclusive of the whole video game world, which in and of itself is content, and many of these video games get very broad exposure, so they offer opportunities. There's books. You can walk into any Barnes & Noble and just take a look at what's on the shelves, especially in kids. You may spot some books. I mean, when you think about, for example, and I talk about books, when you think about Harry Potter. Harry Potter was a book that had been out for a decade before it ever reached the big screen. And so there's many, many examples like that of places to go. The nice thing about entertainment content or intellectual property is it's everywhere. So for any small business owner, entrepreneur, it's just a question of making yourself aware of what's out there. As I say to people, I say, look, the licensing process is as easy as simply identifying something, getting the information of where the owner of that copyright is, whether it's a company or an individual, and making a phone call and saying, I'm interested in licensing XYZ. Do you license it?
What if they say licensing? What's that? What would you say?
They're usually pretty familiar.
Do like a role play. So
Sure.
People want to go after an IP. When they call, who do they ask for and what do they say?
The first thing you'd ask for, maybe it's a book, maybe it's a copyright, whatever. The first thing is to identify, where you think the company or entity that owns the copyright or trademark, whether it's a studio, a TV station, whatever it is to make a phone call and say, I'm interested in licensing XYZ. Can you tell me, do you license it? And if so, who do I speak to about it?
All right, so let's say they transfer you to Jim.
And they say, oh, sure, we have a licensing division. Maybe they don't have a licensing division. You might wind up with an assistant in the marketing department. Or they may say, you know what, we do licensing, but it's handled by an outside agency. Let me connect you with somebody who can give you the information, or here's the information. You'll need to call them direct.
So let's say it's not a developed department, and it's Jim in the marketing department. What do you say to Jim?
It's really a simple case of, hi, I'm interested in licensing so-and-so. If they haven't got a formal program, they will probably ask you, well, what are you interested in doing? And you'll tell them. And they may say something like, well, I'm not sure. I'll need to check. Can you send me something in writing, a proposal?
Do you make them a money offer?
We're getting into negotiation tactics, but generally what you do is they're going to need something in writing anyway, but what you do is you make them a proposal that talks about your company, what products or services you're interested in, where you're going to distribute it, what you think you can do with it, and then you make them an offer. You say, we're prepared to guarantee you $10,000 over 2 years and a royalty rate of 5%. And keep in mind that that's just an opening point. Or on the other side, if they have an established licensing division, they may already have some predefined terms anyway. They may say, okay, yes, we do license. Our minimum guarantees are this. The royalty rate is this. These categories are available, whatever the case is. Then you would be submitting a proposal based on the minimum standards that they require for whatever you're interested in licensing. So the situation just depends.
So let's say there's like these big entertainment properties, Spider-Man, Batman. If an average Joe wants to go after a license for a category in one of those products that's already really developed, what kind of money are we talking about that someone's going to have to put down to acquire something like that?
Well, those are significant. They're obviously very well-known brands.
Are we talking $50,000, $100,000?
Yeah, I think, you'd be looking at $50,000, $100,000, possibly more, depending on the categories you want. But the caveat here is it's all negotiable. It depends on how you approach them. It depends on what product categories you're interested in. There's a whole strategy that's involved, especially in these larger studios, of understanding what you're looking for. I mean, some of the common mistakes that are made by small entrepreneurs or companies that approach the studios is they go in asking for more than they really should and wind up with a very large guarantee. And depending on what the products are, that may or may not be the best approach. There are other strategies that you can use in which you can go to the studios, and if you understand the dynamics of the negotiation, you can begin at a smaller scale, if you will, to get the door open. The key is, in many cases with licensors, is just to establish the relationship. Once you build upon the relationship, you have an opportunity to go in and expand what you'd like to do. And so, again, that requires, you assess the business and what you think you're going to do with it and where you can go and understand the market. And we're getting into some marketing discussions. But, a good part of licensing is marketing. Obviously, it's acquiring the license, and then marketing kicks into the process because of executing on the license.
Let's say I want to speculate and I see maybe an intellectual property that's not developed. Let's say they've invested in it, but it's not going anywhere. As far as the owner knows, it's a loser. They don't know how to market. And I wanted to approach them for like a worldwide exclusive on it. Let's say that the business was dead. Is there a term for getting a total exclusive on an intellectual property where I could control it and then relicense it out?
Well, that's known as sublicensing. And there is a strategy for that in the term. It's known as getting what's called master licensing rights, with rights to sublicense. In some cases, that partnership strategy or that licensing strategy makes sense. And in other cases, it doesn't. It just depends. That is a strategy, actually, when you talk about licensing agents. There's some licensing agents that actually go in and, in effect, become the master licensee with sublicensing.
Do you have an example of something we'd know?
Oftentimes what happens is, I'll use apparel brands in certain instances in which the owner of the brand isn't the manufacturer. They actually just have the brand. They'll license an apparel manufacturer to make it. In many cases, they'll give them the rights to sublicense ancillary categories, accessory items, things like that they in themselves don't make. But it's a better strategy to enable the anchor apparel licensee to do the sublicensing because they can better coordinate the look of the products and the packaging and the brand than the licensor can. That may be one example of a company doing that.
Let's talk about an example here. You've got one of your stories called Taking It to the Bank, and it was a small guy who had a blow mold for a Batman bank. Tell me about that.
Yeah, again, it's one of these entrepreneurs who had a relationship and went to Warner Brothers and had an idea about making these blow-molded banks. Blow molding is just a process where basically you create those plastic banks. You've probably seen them piggy banks, and the term for it is blow mold. Anyway, he went to Warner Brothers and basically, through building a relationship, said, I want to do these banks, and then came up with the idea that said, what if we offered these banks to one of your big promotional partners? Because another side of licensing is what's called promotional licensees, and those are the big promotional partners, the fast food, the beverage.
Yeah, McDonald's and Burger King, right.
Those are known as promotional licensees, and those are the ones that license the rights to do the Happy Meals or whatever the heck it is.
And that's a category, right?
Yeah, that in and of itself is a category, and those tend to be the much larger deals because they're licensed more for their promotional dollars they're going to put behind the tie-ins, if you will. But understanding the opportunities that open the door through licensing, this gentleman's idea was, what if I offered these blow-molded banks to one of your promotional partners as a giveaway or a premium to include with their product? As it turns out, they wound up doing a deal with the cereal company.
So did the bank manufacturer have to acquire a license?
Well, that is an interesting question, too, because this shows the different levels. What happens is they were looking to develop it as a premium item. A premium item means that you're not selling it at retail, but what you're doing is you're making it for someone else to include as part of a product or as a giveaway to incentivize people to buy the product. And so in this case, he actually did take both a retail license for the bank as well as the rights to do it as a premium. And so ultimately what we put together and what was created was taking the blow-molded bank and shrink wrapping it onto the boxes of cereal. And it all seemed like a great idea, and the cereal company decided to do black boxes of Batman cereal, which had never been done, and there's lots of reasons why you don't do black boxes of cereal. So anyway, they put this together, and he wound up getting an initial order of hundreds of thousands of pieces, and they shipped them out there, and the cereal company shrink-wrapped them on the boxes, and they shipped them out, and they put them on the store shelves. Well, something happened they weren't quite expecting. What happened is the kids went into the store, saw the cereal with the blow-molded banks, reached up, grabbed the cereal boxes, and ripped off the blow-molded banks and left the cereal boxes. Now, this is an interesting story because people don't realize there's many things that occur that are outside your control or you even think about, especially when it comes to entertainment and kids. And this is one of those unique situations where nobody had anticipated that kids would reach up and do that. This is why, for example, and this was done obviously a number of years ago, you don't find cereal boxes with products wrapped on the outside. That's why the prize is always inside, okay? But these are just interesting stories that evolve. So he did very well by simply being engaged, getting Batman early on, going into the studio, leveraging the relationship, talking to people, finding out what was going on, showing the product around.
And he got a deal with the cereal manufacturer.
And he got a deal with the cereal company.
Okay, but the lesson here, without that retail license or that premium license or whatever he had, he wouldn't have had the clout to go to that cereal company because they could just go around and get it themselves.
Well, no, and also he was put directly in touch with the cereal company because he had a product that seemed to make sense. And one of the interesting opportunities that you get when you become a licensee, you know, when you're part of a licensed entertainment property or sports or whatever, you're part of a group. And what the licensor looks to do is to maximize their revenue opportunities. And a lot of that has to do with introducing licensees to one another to develop cross-promotions.
For more exclusive interviews on business, marketing, advertising, and copywriting, go to Michael Senoff's hardtofindseminars.com. Once you get that license, you truly are a partnership.
Oh, you are. And so it really opens up the doors. And for a lot of small businesses, they don't understand. They could partner up with some very, very large companies, depending on what type of product you're doing. I mean, I had a client from Australia that introduced a new preschool product, and we wound up getting him the Bee Movie and Wiggles and Thomas the Tank.
Tell me how that evolved. I think that's one of your stories. They were out of Australia. What were they manufacturing?
Well, they manufactured radio-controlled vehicles for preschoolers. A little different. The control mechanisms were different, but the idea was they had some innovative technology, and they wanted to introduce those or the products into the United States, into their brand. And, you know, after meeting with me and explaining the cost and the logistics of having to establish themselves, we had presented to them the idea of licensing kids' brands.
Did they understand that concept?
Absolutely. And they went back, they did some research, they did some evaluation, called me back a couple of months later, and they said, we understand exactly what you're talking about, and we want to come out and engage you to launch us into the United States using licensing. And that's what we did. So they came out, and I worked with them to set the company up to be in a position to go and get the licenses. That requires understanding how to make the presentations, the distribution, because, again, they were a startup. They hadn't established themselves in the U.S., so we wanted to make sure that we covered all the bases.
Tell me a couple things. So let's say someone's listening to this international, they're manufacturing something, they want to break into the U.S. So what are some of the things they need to think about to be positioned properly to acquire the license? Like what are some of the stuff you did for them that's real important that they better have going on?
Among the things that they need to do, obviously, is they need to make sure, you know, you can't just show up and say, okay, we want to get the license without having some kind of sales organization, some kind of distribution platform, some kind of U.S. office representation. I mean, there's certain things that you need to do, and there's certain questions that are going to need to be answered. And so what I do is I work with them saying, all right, we've got to get a presentation developed to answer key questions that they're going to want to know. I mean, distribution is always a very big thing. If you don't have distribution, it's going to really hinder your ability to qualify for the license. If you don't have a sales organization, you can provide information that says, listen, we have either these sales reps or inside salespeople, and here are the accounts that we can call on. Okay, and there's ways in which you can partner up with organizations to help you get those kind of resources in place. So what I do is I work with them to make sure that we had the right information compiled into a presentation that I knew was going to be critical for the licensors in evaluating the company to get those licenses. And then, of course, a lot of it, too, the reason they bring me on board is because of my relationships with the various licensors, especially the studios, through the years of all the people that I've worked with over the years and their movement to other studios. So, a lot of it is relationship-driven. A lot of the value I provide for clients is the fact that I know the right people to talk to. Beyond that is once we help them evaluate which licenses make sense for the product, because we want to maximize it, and then we go through the process of identifying which brands are still available for the categories that they want, especially for toys. It's not always available. And then we were able to identify certain kids' brands that were available, and based on the presentations, part of the presentations, of course, are a overall proposal of what product categories the company would like and what they project they could do with them from a sales perspective and what kind of financial commitment they're prepared to make.
For example, they had this product out of Australia. In your expertise, could you just drop that product in with an established company with sales representation and distribution and say, look, guys, here's this great product. We're going to go after these 3 or 4 different licenses, and if we get the licenses, would you guys be willing to go in on this, promote this, and get us the distribution? Was it something like that?
Right. In other words, again, that's a partnership strategy. And there's many, many ways in which you can leverage a partnership. You can work with companies that already have existing distribution under a strategic alliance. And so there's many ways in which you can, if you will, create the infrastructure.
Or just go into existing infrastructure.
Right. That's what you're doing. You're essentially, if you want to call it borrowing somebody's infrastructure, whatever it is, but you're creating these relationships ahead of time. And most of them are done just through contracts, written agreements. But you've got that in place now, and now what you're able to do is when you make your presentations, you're able to present to them the fact that you've got, 6 reps over here, and you call on these retail accounts, whatever the case is.
So what kind of investment did they have to come up with, just ballpark, to acquire those licenses, and then what happened with that client?
The acquisition costs were based on the strategy that I laid out for them in terms of negotiating the deals. And for them to acquire, they acquired the B-Movie and Wiggles, Thomas the Tank, Little Golden Books. And we put deals together, the sum total of which cost them upfront $35,000.
That's not too bad.
No, because the way we structured the deals and the product categories we asked for and the financial commitments we structured in such a way that we could push it back on the back end of the contract, number one. And number two, we didn't go in asking for too much. We kept it balanced because the key was once we got the license, we began to build a relationship. And what happened actually as we started to develop product in the various licenses, we actually went back in and acquired more products that we had the rights to produce. And in many cases, we got those additional products with no additional fees added to the license.
I got you.
Okay. But that, again, those are nuances of the strategy of opening up the door, negotiating, putting the deals together, things like that.
Can we do another story?
Sure, let's do one more story.
All right, how about the Terminator jacket?
Now, that's an interesting story. Again, I was retained by a company. It was a new apparel company, and they were looking for a way to expand. So one of the opportunities they saw at the time, the 4th installment of the Terminator movie was coming out, and it just so happened that once again, through my relationships, I knew the person that was handling the licensing for Terminator. And so in working with this company, we were discussing, what could you really license for the Terminator? And it turns out that they were a company looking to expand and get greater visibility. And so one of the areas that we looked at was doing a replica jacket that the Terminator wore in the movie, that leather coat. And so what we did is we talked about it, and basically what I did is work with them and then go in and once again position the company. We had to go through setting up the distribution, making sure all the questions are answered, get them ready for the presentation, go in, make the presentation that here's the company, here's how we would do it, this is what we're looking to do. And this is after finding out, of course, what categories are available. Part of what I did for them is to go in and have that initial conversation, say what product categories may be available. And so determining the jackets we went in and made a presentation, and ultimately we created a program where we thought, wouldn't it be great to have these replica jackets as collectibles, limited editions? And so that's what we created. We got the license and decided to do limited editions. And as we developed the product, we had come up with the idea, let's do a very, very high-end jacket where there would only be 500 of them, but they would be known as the gold edition because we would get certificates of authenticity signed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Terminator, which we did.
Who owned the license on the Terminator?
It was a complicated license because it's owned by several parties. Interesting story behind that one, Terminator 4, that's why you never saw the Terminator in total, the robot, because they didn't have the rights to the actual Terminator robot.
Oh, they didn't.
That's why you didn't see a lot of it in the movie. You only saw partial pieces of it. But at any rate, we had licensed it for the jacket, so we did these collectible jackets. And then we did a lower-end collectible jacket. The gold jackets were going to be $2,500, I think they were, and then we had a lower-end jacket that was like $600 or $700 that did not have the limited edition authenticity. And then as part of that deal, they were developing the movie, and so there were all sorts of promotions that were being developed around the movie, around the country. And so as the license evolved, we took advantage of all the different promotional opportunities that were occurring around the world, actually. And the jacket was actually part of a number of movie promotions in which there was print and radio where people could enter and win prizes, and one of the prizes was these jackets. And they got publicity in Japan, they got publicity in Europe with the jacket being featured in a lot of these print ads online and television that were being put together by the promotional companies that were promoting the movie openings around the world. And then, of course, we leveraged up the retail opportunities that the studio was developing for the Terminator merchandise. Once again, it's just, another small company tapping into a license that allowed them to leverage up and expand their distribution.